Thank you for joining us this evening. You are attending the webinar entitled The Enduring Impact of the American Dust Bowl Adaptation to Environmental Catastrophe and Environmental Refugees. Our leader for this session is Richard Hornbeck, the V. Duane Rath Professor of Economics and Neubauer Family Faculty Fellow, the Booth School of Business, the University of Chicago. I'd also like to acknowledge Sarah Wiseman, Liberty High School, Frisco, Texas. Sarah is a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council who will serve as our TA for tonight's session. She'll be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and asking questions. Sarah, we appreciate you being here. You have truly been a friend to the program, and we have enjoyed working with you throughout the year and look forward to working with you more in the future. Richard Hornbeck is the V. Duane Rath Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. Rick is an economic historian and applied microeconomist whose research focuses on the historical development of the American economy. He views history as informing why some places and some people have become wealthier, while others have remained poorer, which can provide perspective on what factors might drive widespread improvements in living standards. His published research includes articles in the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Political Economy. He is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, affiliated with programs on the development of the American economy, development economics, and environmental and energy economics. Prior to joining Chicago Booth in 2015, Rick was the Dunlop Associate Professor of American History in the Economics Department at Harvard University. He received an Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship in 2014 and was selected for the 2009 Review of Economic Studies Tour. He received a PhD in economics from MIT in 2009 and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Chicago in 2004. To our network of teachers, both nationally and internationally, and without further ado, I present to you our scholar for the evening, Richard Hornbeck. Rick, thank you for joining us. We look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk with you all tonight, and with the idea of perhaps sparking some things that you might find useful to incorporate into your own courses and other things that you might be thinking about. So the talk overall is going to focus on the Dust Bowl, and particularly this idea of sort of learning from history about adaptation to environmental change. And one particular important aspect of that adaptation is migration and sort of the movement of people. And so those are going to be the main themes that I'm going to focus on. I wanted to sort of jump quickly to sort of the end in a sense. Sort of pedagogically, I think there's three themes that I want to emphasize with this idea of sort of incorporating into a humanistic tradition, incorporating into sort of a history curriculum, sort of what does economists' perspective often look like, and what do different approaches to some of these questions often compare. And so I'm going to contrast a little bit more of like a documentary approach to sort of understanding history as opposed to sort of a more data-driven approach to understanding history. Also contrasting a little bit kind of a narrative approach that would emphasize sort of particular individual people's perspectives and experience versus sort of more data-driven kind of empirical research design. And I think it's a nice sort of using history and just sort of the inherent interestingness of different historical episodes is a nice lever and opportunity to sort of expose people to the use of data and statistics and sort of ways of doing statistical inference about causality to try to understand why different things have changed certain ways over time. And then the third theme that I'm going to try to come back to by the very end is sort of drawing some dichotomy between history as a study of learning about the past as compared to history as a study of learning from the past. And so rather than perhaps sort of using economics tools or other tools to sort of learn about the past itself, it's sort of using history and different statistical tools and data to sort of learn about how the world works generally. Not necessarily about how the world is today, because today often gives a very narrow view into how the world works generally. And so by drawing on the past, we can just get a richer understanding of what sort of general phenomenon might affect the way the world works. So those are going to be some themes that I'm going to look to come back to. Um, so for today, I'm going to get into the Dust Bowl, but I wanted to give a quick sort of like a amuse-bouche, if you will, of this broader idea of how technology interacts with the environment. Um, this idea that new technologies, when they're introduced, often have very different impacts on different people, on different places, and those impacts often vary with sort of differences in the underlying natural environment. So one example of that from some recent ongoing research of mine looks at, for example, the introduction of steam power and the transition from the use of water power to steam power, like who adopted steam power, whether it was by incumbent firms or entrants, and this process of creative destruction and sort of a leapfrogging phenomenon by which some people might come into the economy fresh and sort of bring that sort of new perspective and sort of leapfrog over other firms or places that might be sort of locked into a previous way of doing things. And so, in trying to understand, well, what was the impact of steam power on the US economy? A natural comparison to make is sort of, well, there are some places in the US that have more water power potential based on the flow of rivers and drops in elevation. There's some places that have less water power potential. And so here's just a slide from some of that work, sort of comparing different counties within the United States. Darker shaded counties have sort of more local water power potential. Lighter shaded counties have less water power potential. And the premise of a lot of this analysis is to compare across these different sorts of counties, how did they change as steam became increasingly available? Another good example of this is from some early research of mine on the role that property rights enforcement played in the development of the American plains, where it was becoming increasingly costly to secure land as settlement moved into the western frontier, because in order to secure land, you had to build a lawful fence around that land. And those fences were becoming increasingly expensive as people moved into places where there was very little local woodland. And so there's some places in the US that have sort of more woodland, less woodland, even on the frontier. And that affected the availability of this previous technology, the wooden fences. And so this work looks at the introduction of barbed wire, and it thinks about, well, as barbed wire became available in the 1870s, 1880s, it was really these sort of lighter shaded, low woodland counties that were particularly affected relative to the darker shaded, higher woodland counties. And so the idea of the sort of statistical exercise is, well, we could compare sort of average changes in these lighter shaded counties to the darker shaded counties and get some inference about how barbed wire and through the use of barbed wire, how the ability to secure land affected agricultural development. A third example is thinking about the introduction of the railroads, for example, and how did sort of railroads and market integration affect American economic development? What role did the sort of increasingly integrated domestic economy play for sort of the overall development of the U.S. economy? Now, before the railroads, there was another technology also. So there were waterways. And so you can sort of map out all of these different places that had access to natural waterways within the interior of the United States, along with the Great Lakes, the coasts, and also the sort of the canal system that had been built. But prior to the railroads, it was sort of very dependent on this sort of natural and canal construction. But there were some places you couldn't really build canals, and so there was railroad construction over the sort of following decades. I'll sort of just click through, and you can see the railroad network roll out through the 19th century. And so by the end of the 19th century, into the early 20th century, railroad network had become quite dense. And so intuitively, this new technology is going to have differential effects across places based on some places becoming increasingly connected that didn't previously have good connections through the waterway system. And so in this research, we sort of come up with similar maps that look like the water power maps, that look like the woodland maps. This is the darker shaded counties are the ones that experience sort of greater increase in connection to other places, whereas the lighter shaded counties had less relative change in their connectedness to other places. And so you can do a similar sort of statistical exercise and look at, well, what's happening to land values in these darker shaded places relative to lighter shaded places within the same state, within the same sort of other characteristics. And you can sort of use this idea of sort of relative changes over time using data to sort of learn something about how the economy is changing with these different phenomena. One example of this is actually a way of building on this. So one of my PhD students that was on the job market this year and sort of took a faculty job at Florida State uh, has this work that's looking at the introduction of the Mackay stitcher in the mid 19th century, which sort of disrupted the shoemaking industry, and in particular, dramatically decreased the amount of labor that was needed to sort of sew the upper parts of shoes to the lower parts of shoes. And so, in particular places where the Mackay stitcher was licensed, um, sort of there was a dramatic decrease in the number of shoemakers that were needed in those places. And so, you see a lot of shoemakers lose their jobs, and then the natural question is, well, over time, what happens when there's this technological disruption? When there's technological change that sort of leads people to leave certain industries or occupations, what happens to those people? And in particular, what happens to those people's children over time? And so this work looks at sort of this adaptation to technological disruption and finds quite persistent impacts on children of the next generation, very limited migration, and just to try to understand some of these general questions about how do people respond to changes in technology over time. So I wanted to get back to this interaction sort of between technology and the environment, as we could think about a lot of these technological changes are in some way compensating for some natural limitation in the underlying environment. That where we don't have water power, we can use steam power. We don't have wood, we can use barbed wire. We don't have navigable waterways, we can use the railroads. And so it starts to raise some questions about, well, does technology sort of inevitably adapt to make the natural environment less important? Um, it, as we move toward a more and more sort of technologically advanced society, are we converging to some situation where kind of the underlying natural environment is sort of less and less relevant? And I think an interesting counterexample to this is some other early research of mine, which looked at the enduring impacts of the American Dust Bowl. And to start off, well, how would you evaluate, well, what was the effect of the Dust Bowl? What happened through the Dust Bowl? In setting up those previous maps, I can sort of show you a map here that I got from the National Archives, which shows after the Dust Bowl, the darker shaded places had lost more than 75% of their original topsoil. The light gray shaded places had lost between 25% and 75% of their original topsoil. And the light areas had lost less than 25% of their original topsoil in some surveys that were done by the Soil Conservation Service and the Soil Erosion Service. And so I think at this point, intuitively, you could understand that the idea is, well, let's compare the darker shaded counties to the lighter shaded counties or the non shaded counties within the same state with sort of similar agricultural characteristics prior to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And we can sort of understand, well, what were the immediate consequences of this erosion? But also, in particular, how much were the consequences of this erosion mitigated over time? What adaptations did people make? And did sort of technological change or did sort of people's own production adjustments somewhat substantially or fully mitigate the effects of this environmental shock? Or were they actually quite persistent? And to the extent that the economy did adapt, through what main margins did that adaptation occur? And so this project, this sort of early research of mine, examines this data from the Census of Agriculture and the Census of Population on areas that became more eroded versus less eroded, and looks to compare otherwise similar counties. At the outset, we can see from sort of agricultural land value data that the Dust Bowl was indeed a major shock to agriculture. We see that land values decreased substantially and persistently, but along with that, agricultural revenues also declined and only recovered somewhat over time. Now, I think this is an opportunity to kind of, in discussing history, sort of bring in some other fields also and some intuitions, maybe like from economics or from math or from some other settings where if I told you that sort of the value of some particular asset has gone down by, say, 20%, but also that period's rent on that asset, that period's returns on that asset has also gone down by 20%, you would think that those effects are probably going to be fairly persistent, right? So if home values declined by 20% and home rents declined by 20%, that would give an indication that whatever just happened is probably a pretty persistent shock. Whereas if rents went down by 20% in some city, but the value of homes in that city only went down by 5%, then you would probably interpret that as, well, there's some short-term shock that's happening. Maybe there's like a lot of traffic or construction, or like there's some disamenity in that place right now that's driving down rents to be in that neighborhood. But the overall value of houses isn't really declining because people understand that relatively soon that place is going to be more appealing. So intuitively, you can kind of compare what happens to land values and agricultural revenues to get a sense of how persistent do people think this shock is going to be. And then over the subsequent 70 years, we can look at indeed how persistent was the shock. Did land values recover? Did rents or revenues, in a sense, recover also? And we find that the adjustment was actually quite limited, that there were some margins along which people could have adjusted which crops they were growing, but it was very delayed and didn't really start to pick up for at least sort of 15 or 20 years, almost sort of a generational adjustment process. Some people had to leave farming and other people enter farming before you really saw a lot of these more substantial adjustments taking place. And this is somewhat at odds with kind of a narrative that was forming at the time, which I'll come back to later. And so, you know, when you think about like the Ken Burns view of the Dust Bowl, or when you think about sort of the way that the government at the time was characterizing the Dust Bowl, you get a very different kind of view than when you start to look at the data itself. All right, so how did the economy adapt? Most of the adjustment that took place was through migration, through labor markets. So we saw immediate substantial out-migration from the most affected areas. And it was sort of further out-migration even over the next sort of 10 or 20 years that started to sort of bring wages and unemployment back into sort of equilibrium. Okay, so that's kind of a preview overall of what some of this research finds. I want to circle back a little bit and give a bit of perspective on what the Dust Bowl was, where it came from, and what kind of narratives have formed around it. So the typical way of thinking about what the Dust Bowl was is that the agricultural frontier was pushing westward in the United States over sort of the 19th century and into the 20th century, particularly with World War I, that took a lot of land out of production in Europe. There was a substantial increase in the price of different agricultural goods. And so there was a strong incentive to expand the agricultural frontier and start farming more and more, given the sort of substantial boom to the demand for American exports. It led to a large increase in the prices of agricultural goods, which then fell going into the 1920s after the end of World War I and sort of European production coming more in line. And so there was starting to be somewhat of a depression in the agricultural sector, even in the 1920s, prior to the Great Depression, as a consequence of these lower prices. Now, production itself was still quite high, and in particular, sort of in the sort of late 20s, early 30s, agricultural production was very high. It's just that prices were low, and that's why farmers were struggling. Then a pretty severe drought started to begin in 1931 and persisted, with especially severe droughts in 1934 and 1936. And these severe droughts contributed to a loss in ground cover. So a lot of crops failed, and the land was relatively bare. And so with this bare land that was relatively susceptible then to erosion, both water erosion and wind erosion, there started to be these sort of large dust storms that would kick up and sort of push dust across the United States, and even sometimes hitting some eastern cities. And even people found some of this dust even on the decks of ships out in the Atlantic. So there was this massive erosion, not just in the sort of classic Dust Bowl era sometimes that people talk around, this sort of circular area around the Oklahoma panhandle, but more broadly throughout the plains. This is a picture of sort of what one of these classic dust storms looked like. And the aftermath is that you would see this sort of substantial erosion. And so the soil would be severely sort of pushed off the land, and sort of sand and silt and these lands were sort of pushed up against a different home in this case. So it was fairly immediately clear that the land was going to be substantially affected, that agricultural productivity was going to decline. And a lot of the historical narrative of what was going on sort of began forming. And in particular, Roosevelt and the government at the time very much attributed this to sort of overexploitation of land. And in part, that could well be true. But in part also, that formed a justification for them. So, for example, through like the Agricultural Adjustment Act and through other sort of New Deal programs, their interest was in trying to cut back agricultural production in order to raise prices and try to increase farmers' purchasing power to try to help pull the country out of the Depression. So there were a lot of Depression-era policies that were trying to restrict output, and a convenient justification for that was that, well, this Dust Bowl is occurring because of the overexploitation of land, and through such adjustment, that helps avoid future Dust Bowls. Now, partly that argument starts to fall apart somewhat when you start to look at the actual data itself. So if you just look at, so for example, like the total amount of land that's in farms in these counties, it was increasing up until the 1930s in panel C here, but it continued to increase even in sort of the 1940s, 1950s, and stayed relatively constant for sort of decades afterward. And we only really started to decline slightly in sort of more recent decades. The sort of general trend in terms of like intensity of production went down somewhat in terms of cropland per farm acre, but didn't change that dramatically and sort of stayed relatively constant. And so we want to sort of understand not just sort of in aggregate what's happening throughout the entire plains, but what's happening in these more eroded versus less eroded areas. And to do so, uh, we're going to sort of use a regression analysis. We're going to use sort of a statistical approach, which is going to think about predicting some outcome Y in a particular county C in a particular decade T. And we're going to think about the mean outcomes Y, predicting it based on, well, the share of the county that's in one of those medium erosion areas, the share of the county that's in one of these high erosion areas, predicting it based on the state that each county is in, the sort of alpha S, the state that they're in, and predicting it based on sort of a whole vector of different county characteristics prior to the 1930s. This X stands for sort of a vector of different county characteristics that might be associated with just different changes. So, for example, more populated or less populated counties, more settled or less settled counties, they might also be changing differently over the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, because the depression is going on. A lot of different changes in agricultural technology are going on. There's a lot that's happening that might differentially affect some places that are more intensive in corn production versus wheat production. And so you might want to sort of think about, well, hypothetically, within this map, can we think about, well, there's some county that has a higher share of its area in the high erosion area, but otherwise has like similar crop suitability, has similar pre-1930s levels of settlement as a county that wasn't so hit by this erosion. And so that's the thought experiment that we're setting up when we're sort of predicting the mean outcomes in each county in each decade based on these different characteristics. And so these coefficients, beta 1 and beta 2, you can think about estimating these, sort of figuring out the sort of conditional mean outcomes, average outcomes in these different sorts of counties, and plotting those coefficients in a figure. And so if we plot, for example, in the solid black line here with the solid dots, these are sort of the relative value of land in highly eroded counties relative to low erosion counties in 1910, in 1920, in 1925, in 1930. And then the hollow squares are the sort of relative value of land in medium erosion counties relative to low erosion counties in 1910, 1920, 1925, 1930. And you can see that sort of the relative value of agricultural land in one type of county versus another type of county was relatively similar across these places and changing relatively similarly. It went down relatively somewhat from 1910 to 1920, but from 1920 to 1930, it was sort of relatively similar in these sorts of counties. We have this kind of experiment, this sort of scientific, if you will, experiment sort of set up in our minds. We have these sort of darker shaded and lighter shaded counties that are changing relatively similarly in the 1920s, but they're about to experience very different levels of erosion. And so, indeed, what you can see from 1930 to 1940 is a sharp relative drop, a 30% relative drop in the value of land in these high erosion counties relative to low erosion counties, and about a 15 to 20% drop in medium erosion counties relative to low erosion counties. And then you can start to carry this through to subsequent decades. And you can see by like 1950, 1960, 1970s, 1990s, the sort of relatively consistent value of land in these places versus other places. Now, beyond just looking at the value of land, we can also think about a variety of different other things that are measured by the Census of Agriculture. So, for example, like the total value of agricultural revenue per farm acre also falls pretty substantially and stays relatively low, especially in these high erosion relative to medium erosion counties. We can sort of compare, well, revenue went down by, say, 35%, but land value went down by about 30%. And so the fact that revenue and value are falling by roughly the same amount means that agricultural land markets thought that the effects were going to be quite persistent. And indeed, the effects were quite persistent. There was relatively limited mitigation of these erosion costs. So this substantial erosion hit these places and made the places much less productive. But then, even over the subsequent decades, there wasn't much successful mitigation of those particular effects. They were quite enduring. Now, what types of adjustments might have taken place? So they might have taken some land out of farmland and moved it into sort of non-farmland. The total amount of farmland per county acre, though, is pretty consistent across these different counties over these decades. They could have changed, for example, their allocation of land toward like wheat versus hay or like crops versus pasture. And so if you compare the relative productivities in these top two panels of land used for wheat versus hay or crops versus pasture, you sort of see sharp relative drops in productivity. But in terms of the share of land that's being allocated to wheat versus hay, there's really not much change. In the share of cropland that's being allocated towards wheat versus hay, it's really only the subsequent, after like 15 or 20 years, you start to see somewhat of a decline in the share of land that's being allocated toward wheat versus hay. Whereas wheat became much less productive, but they didn't really shift their land out of wheat until like 15 or 20 years later. Similarly, you can think about the sort of allocation of land to crops versus pasture. Relative productivities changed, but again, it took about 15 or 20 years before people really started changing their agricultural production. Now, what were the sort of main types of adjustment that took place? Well, what we see in the data is the relative population in these counties fell by about 5 to 10% relative to sort of less eroded counties. And underlying that sort of 5 to 10% drop in population is a lot of human stories. And so this famous picture by Dorothea Lange of these migrants in California, so it captures this particular migrant mother with her children. And it was a very evocative picture. And, the sort of stories that Steinbeck was writing about from these labor camps in California, that Woody Guthrie was writing about in California. There were a lot of narratives that were forming in California of these people that were coming from the plains. Now, it wasn't just people coming from the plains because of the Dust Bowl itself, because of the erosion itself. It was also people coming from the plains because of the Depression, because of technological change, tractors, other things that were sort of decreasing the need for agricultural workers. And so there were a lot of reasons why people were going to California. And so you can't just look at people that are showing up in California and say, like, oh, these are people who migrated because of the Dust Bowl. They could be migrating for a lot of reasons. There was a lot of movement of people throughout the Depression. And so I have some follow-up research that tries to sort of separate out, well, who was moving because of the Dust Bowl, and how can that be distinguished from people that were just generally moving through the 1930s as a consequence of the Depression. And so we want to try to understand, well, who were these particular Dust Bowl migrants? How did the Dust Bowl change migration rates? And in particular, how did the Dust Bowl change the selection of migrants? So who migrated as a consequence of the Dust Bowl compared to just who sort of generally migrates? So in general, across the last 100 years of U.S. history, and in general across a lot of different countries throughout the world, the people who migrate, actually people who tend to be more geographically mobile, tend, for example, to have more education, tend to be more educated, in the sense that people that have more education, their skills, their experiences, their human capital, if you will, tends to be useful across a lot of different places. They also tend to have higher incomes. And so to the extent that migration requires any sort of fixed costs to be paid, is people with higher incomes that are often more able to pay those fixed costs. And so we see generally the people that migrate tend to be people that have more education. But of course, this isn't sort of a usual episode of migration. When the sort of local environment collapses in some particular way, it generates this sense of sort of environmental refugees, if you will. There are sort of people that are pushed out of a place because of this local environmental collapse. And so you might expect that migration phenomenon to be different than the sort of general migration phenomenon that you see in the United States. So going back to this Dorothea Lange photo, one of the things that was sort of striking and very evocative about the migrants to California is that they seem to be notably poorer than a lot of other migrants throughout American history. And actually, I think the Dust Bowl migrant phenomenon is sort of unusual in that there were particular blockades that were set up to try to keep these so-called Dust Bowl migrants from coming to California. And it's, I think, the only example that I can think of this particular sort of resistance to white migrants in U.S. history. It's much more comparable to what you start to see with the great migration of African Americans from the South to the northern United States in the 1950s, 1960s, also the 1940s, where you see sort of black migrants moving to the north, and then efforts in the north to sort of restrict black migrants' access to sort of white neighborhoods and sort of a suburbanization. So there's been a lot of research in sort of economics and economic history about these phenomena of sort of white flight from sort of northern cities to the suburbs, restrictive covenants that are set up, zoning, school districting, various efforts, sort of formally and informally, to sort of create that separation. And you see all this resistance to sort of black migration to the north, which has echoes in it in the sort of resistance to sort of poor white migration to California in the Dust Bowl. So I think there's already some sense that there's something distinctive about this 1930s Dust Bowl migration that we want to sort of understand, because we want to sort of, in a sense, anticipate, well, we have general experiences about migration overall in the economy. We see how migrants differ from non-migrants, but we don't have as many experiences in sort of understanding, well, when there's some major environmental shock, when there's something that causes the local collapse of the environment, who leaves in those situations? And how are those people different from the general migrants that we see leaving places? And so the Dust Bowl provides this opportunity to look at this large sort of environmental shock that's geographically differentiated across places. So there's this sense that we could compare migrants from some counties to migrants from other counties and use that to infer something about how the Dust Bowl changed the nature of migration. The other interesting aspect of the Dust Bowl, it was a largely unanticipated and permanent change to the environment. And so we can sort of see that particular migration response. Whereas when there are temporary shocks, if some year is sort of relatively hot or cold, there's not some sense that people are going to migrate just because this one year is different, because you won't necessarily expect future years to be different also. But the issues with climate change that we're interested in is that, well, the environment might change in some permanent ways that's going to spark migration. And so to understand how that permanent migration response to environmental shocks works, we want to look for opportunities throughout time when there have been permanent changes in the environment. And so that's kind of these lessons that the Dust Bowl provides an opportunity to better understand. Now, a third advantage of really trying to understand this Dust Bowl migration phenomenon is leveraging just the excellent availability of data. So the U.S. has a long history of collecting census data. It was required in the Constitution in order to sort of allocate representatives. But as they were sort of collecting this information on population to allocate representatives, they sort of figured, well, they might as well collect other information also. And so in conducting these censuses of population, there's a rich amount of information that we have on people. Now, in particular, in the 1940 census, they asked an unusual question that they don't typically ask in the census population, is that they asked people where they lived in 1935, 5 years prior. And the reason why they added this question is because there were high rates of internal mobility in the United States in the 1930s, and the government wanted to understand better, well, what was going on with this mobility. And so we can see everybody in the 1940 census where they were living in 1935. We don't have to try to link people genealogically, say, across like different waves of the census on Ancestry or otherwise. We can sort of directly see where they were living in 1935. And also, just the full 100% sample of these data are available. And so you can see everybody in the census and where they were. It's not confidential anymore. After 72 years, the census data gets released. And we can use the same sort of approach that we used in that earlier work, looking at the enduring impacts on agricultural land values and other outcomes, to compare, well, what happened to these more eroded places relative to less eroded places. So in trying to understand who these Dust Bowl migrants were using this data, there's a natural opportunity to sort of compare and contrast across other sort of illustrations and examples of the Dust Bowl migrants. Even in the 1930s, these Dust Bowl migrants took on an immediate cultural and social significance. They're represented by Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, Dorothea Lange's photography. And I think one of the reasons why, and of course I should mention Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl ballads. Woody Guthrie has this great song, Do Re Mi, basically talking about if you ain't got the do re mi, if you ain't got the do re mi, then you better just not even try to go to California. And in a sense, the dough is in the money. You need the sort of do re mi, the money, in order to try to get into California, in order to try to make it in California. Basically, talking about the plight of these people that showed up in California poor, that didn't have money to potentially get started, and were stuck in these labor migrant camps. And in particular, this sort of poverty, these struggles of the Dust Bowl migrants started to really exemplify this sense of breakdown in the economic system during the Great Depression. Um, and so there's been some, even at that time in the 1930s, there was already some surveys that were being done on migrants that were showing up in California to try to look at, well, where are they coming from, and what are their characteristics, and what can we understand about these migrants. There's been other work to sort of look at the overall sort of Dust Bowl region and people coming from these sort of Central Plains areas, how they compare to others. But really, a lot of this is going to combine people that are moving because of the Dust Bowl itself with people that were just generally moving because of the Depression and other technological changes that might have been hitting these areas. And so we want to look at using this same kind of relative comparison of more eroded versus less eroded places. Well, what do the migrants from this county look like that are sort of in the Oklahoma Panhandle region relative to migrants in some other county that's nearby that are sort of less eroded? So more eroded versus less eroded places, even within nearby areas. Okay, so what do I mean by like the selection of migrants? Why are migrants selected? Well, in general, when people consider migrating from one place to another, the returns to migration and the cost of migration can often vary by people's characteristics. Right? So there's some characteristics of people that are fairly fixed. There's also characteristics of people that are potentially changeable. So, for example, like how much education you get, that's something that is sort of potentially changeable. And so if you anticipate that you're going to really want to move somewhere else, you might invest in certain skills or education or otherwise that's going to be more suitable or more useful in that other place. So, for example, if you expect, in 5 years to move to a country where Spanish is spoken at like high rates, then you might just start teaching yourself Spanish now. And so people that move to Spanish-speaking countries will tend to sort of be more likely to speak Spanish. Similarly, people that move to English-speaking countries will be more likely to speak English probably than people that don't move to English-speaking countries. And part of that is because, well, the returns to moving to that country are different if you speak the language versus not. And so, in a sense, planned migration, where you anticipate that you're going to move, can cause very different sorts of migrants than unplanned migration, where you're sort of a refugee in a sense, where you're forced to move out of a certain. And so, if we want to understand these sort of environmental refugees, we really want to sort of see, well, when there's this unplanned environmental change, how are people migrating in response to that? Then to do so, we put together a variety of different data sources. So the same sorts of data that I mentioned from this earlier research, but along with the census of population. This 1940 census is also the notable census, and that's the first one that asks people about their wage and salary income. Prior to that, there's only information on people's occupation. And so it's a particularly rich census to sort of explore what's happening to people in these from these more and less eroded areas. Then we take that data and we combine it with data on those mapped erosion levels from the Soil Conservation Service using like ArcView GIS kind of software. And then we can characterize these counties as sort of more or less eroded. Then the sort of prediction that we end up doing about what's happening to these migrants, what's happening to these counties is very similar to what I set up for you before, but interacted more with sort of this idea of who's a migrant. So just on sort of equation 2 here is saying, well, there's some characteristic of some person I has some characteristic Y, and those that are migrants versus those that aren't migrants might differ in that characteristic. So people that are migrants might have more or less education, years of education completed, than people who aren't migrants. So equation 2 is telling us, in a sense, well, how many more years of education does a migrant have relative to a non-migrant? But then what equation 3 is telling us is it's telling us, well, there are these general differences between migrants and non-migrants, but how different are those differences for migrants from high erosion counties relative to migrants from low erosion counties? migrants from medium erosion counties relative to migrants from low erosion counties, right? And so the idea now is we can compare, well, how did the Dust Bowl itself shift the selection of migrants? How did it change the nature of migration? And so what we see when we look at the data is that indeed we see that there's more migration out of the more eroded areas. And in particular, there's more migration to California. Moving to California in general was fairly rare. Most people that migrated from the plains areas go to sort of relatively nearby counties. Right? Migrating to California overall wasn't very common, but migrating to California became particularly more common from the eroded areas relative to the non-eroded areas. So now we see that there are these sort of identifiable greater numbers of migrants that are going to California and going to sort of these places relative from eroded counties relative to non-eroded counties. Then we can start to characterize, well, what do those migrants look like? Now, we don't know that any particular person is a Dust Bowl migrant. Right? We can't sort of look into their hearts or their minds and determine, did they move because of the Dust Bowl and they wouldn't have moved if not for the Dust Bowl? We can look at everybody who's leaving the eroded counties. We can look at everybody who's leaving the non-eroded counties. We can say, well, everybody's leaving the eroded counties. They're the sorts of people that if they had been in a non-eroded county, they probably also would have migrated. But there's just some additional people also that we call compliers, that they're migrating because that county was more eroded. And if they had been in a low erosion county, they probably wouldn't have migrated. So we can characterize what the characteristics of those compliers look like. People that sort of do this thing because they were in an eroded county, they wouldn't have done it if they had been in a less eroded county. And so we see that in general, migrants tend to have more years of education. They're what's called positively selected. They're positively selected in the particular sense that they have more years of education. They have a greater number of years of education. But those that were migrating because of the Dust Bowl have less education. They have fewer years of education. They're what's sometimes referred to as negatively selected, which is not meant to be a pejorative term. It's just negatively in the terms of they have a smaller number of years of education. Right. Otherwise, though, the people that were migrating from the Dust Bowl look more similar to people that were general migrants. So, for example, you might have expected before looking at the data that it would be mostly people leaving farms. But it wasn't just agricultural workers or agricultural landowners that were leaving the more eroded places. It was also just a more broad migration across non-agricultural places, non-agricultural people in these counties as well. All right, so then I think that's really just like one of the advantages of looking at the data itself is that you can find things that are sort of not necessarily expected. That just when you look at the data, you see, oh, similar numbers of people who had been on farms are leaving as people who hadn't previously. All right, so then that's kind of characterizing the out selection in a sense, that how are people that are migrating different from people that are not migrating? Now, on the flip side, there's this idea of in selection. That sort of people that are migrating, how different are they from natives in a sense in the place where they're going? So people that had been living in California, people that had been living in the counties where these new migrants show up, how are those people that had been living there different from the new migrants that show up? And so this is where you start to see that sort of Steinbeck view, that Woody Guthrie view, that Dorothea Lange view much more, that the Dust Bowl migrants that are showing up, they have a more agricultural past. But in part, that's because everybody that's moving to California has a more agricultural past than the average person who was living in California before. And so what you see is you see this narrative forming that all these agricultural people are coming to California. It's not that more agricultural people are more likely to leave Oklahoma and sort of eroded areas, but it's just that everybody who's coming to California has a more agricultural past than the people that had been in California. The Dust Bowl migrants in particular, they are struggling in California. They have lower incomes, and it's compounded by the fact that all of the migrants that are going, especially those migrants that are going to California, have much lower incomes than people that had previously been in California. So poorer people in general are showing up in California, and that's particularly true of people coming from more eroded places. But that sort of contrasts with the idea that that doesn't necessarily mean that the Dust Bowl itself is causing those people to be poorer. And in fact, given that people had the option of migrating, we see that in 1939, people's incomes from more eroded counties and less eroded counties is relatively similar. That land values have gone down hugely in more eroded counties relative to less eroded counties. But if you look at everyone's income of people that were from more eroded counties versus less eroded counties, both those people that migrated and the people that didn't migrate, overall, on average, their incomes aren't that different in 1939. So this environmental shock had really large, persistent impacts on places, on the land itself, but it didn't have so large impacts on the people because the people could move. And so you see this sort of remarkable adaptation. And so it's actually much more of a success story, I think, than you would think from the photography and such, where by the ability to move, people successfully mitigated a lot of the impact that might have otherwise happened on them if they had been forced to stay in those places. And so I think there's a general theme that starts to emerge from this, which is that as the environment changes, in particular, maybe as the climate changes, what impacts that's going to have is really centrally shaped by the migration responses that are taking place. Land is sort of relatively captive and immobile. So, particular lands around the world are going to get much less productive as temperatures increase, as there's flooding, as their sea level rises. So, certain lands are going to become much less habitable. But people themselves, to the extent that they're able to move, can substantially mitigate those impacts. And so, a lot of the focus can be on, well, given the various impediments to migration, particularly sometimes moving from country to country, what could be done to potentially relax those political constraints or financial constraints that might keep people from being able to migrate would be an incredibly important sort of human focused policy to sort of mitigate the consequences of climate change for people themselves, while highlighting the fact that these environmental refugees are potentially very different migrants than the people that are typically leaving these places. And so it's sort of preparing for movement of people in response to local collapse of the environment that might be very atypical from the experiences where from year to year we tend to observe different types of migration patterns now. And it's very different people that are migrating now than might be migrating in the future if the environment collapses. All right. And so kind of returning back to some of these themes that I mentioned at the beginning. So I think now I've sort of shown you a little bit about like, well, what does history look like? What does economic history look like? Bringing in more data, statistics, sort of an economics perspective on this is sort of looking for ways that we can draw on different data sources to sort of characterize systematically what's going on in terms of the average experiences, which can be different sometimes than the narratives that would form and sort of particular anecdotes or accounts that might show up. Now, those accounts are very vivid and they're very memorable. Like many more people are going to see and remember Dorothea Lange's photography than are ever going to read or remember the research that I've done. And so characterizing the Dust Bowl migrants is sort of mostly, better done perhaps and more memorably done in that photography and the music and the literature. But it can give a somewhat skewed view in terms of the average experiences that people themselves actually had. Also, then, in combining with that use of data, it's important to set up those sorts of maps that I was showing you before, sort of more affected places versus less affected places. We can't just look at what happened in the 1930s and say everything that happened in the 1930s was because of the Dust Bowl, or everything that happened in the 1930s is because of the Depression. You want to look at some places that were more or less exposed to shocks from the Depression, or places that were more or less exposed to erosion from the Dust Bowl. And by using that relative variation, you can start to tease out, well, what was the effect of the Dust Bowl itself as distinguishable from other things that were happening in the 1930s. Then the third theme was this sense of sort of drawing this dichotomy of both trying to learn about what's happening in the 1930s, but also sort of trying to see, well, how do we use what happened in the 1930s to learn something about how the world works generally? And so this isn't to say that sort of the people that migrated because of the Dust Bowl are the same people that are going to migrate because of like global warming or climate change, but perhaps by sort of seeing, well, how were migrants to the Dust Bowl different from other migrants during the 1930s can sort of tell us something about how sort of environmental shocks themselves shift the nature of migration. And so we don't observe these sorts of large catastrophic environmental shocks very often. And so we don't have much recent experience with this. I don't know if The Simpsons are still popular amongst like kids these days, but one of my favorite quotes from The Simpsons is there's this big hurricane that hit Springfield. And, they're concerned that there might be this hurricane. And Lisa in particular is very concerned that there's this hurricane coming that's going to be very destructive. And they say, "Oh, Lisa, don't worry. There's no record of a hurricane ever hitting Springfield." And she says, "Yes, but the records only go back to 1970 when the Hall of Records was mysteriously destroyed." Right? And so there's this sense that sort of by keeping these records around, by keeping this data around, we can learn from experiences prior to sort of recent lived experiences. And so by learning something about, well, how did these sort of environmental catastrophes shift the nature of migration, we can try to learn something about how this sort of environmental migration might be different than sort of typical migration you would otherwise observe. All right. So I think the way that we planned this is that rather than having like questions in the middle, we're going to sort of look to push that out. And I'm very interested to hear what sort of questions you might have and ways that this can be useful to you across different applications. And so let's look to like open it up now more to questions and sort of see what else I could go into perhaps in more detail or what might be useful.
Good deal. Thank you so much. And again, everyone, please feel free to enter your questions in the audience chat, or you can enter them in the managed Q&A. Rick, I was just looking through the chat, and I saw a response there from Courtney that I found really interesting. And Courtney, thank you for sharing that. But she mentioned that her grandmother and her grandmother and her parents migrated from Oklahoma to California, and that her great grandma worked in a cannery. So when the farms went under, the cannery did too. Even though the family wasn't farmers, they were directly impacted by the farmland being destroyed. And Courtney, thank you for sharing that. Rick, can you speak to any other industries or areas that were directly impacted? I know you spoke about it from the agrarian standpoint, but any of the ripple effects that the teachers should consider?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example of why the sort of general economy and sort of other sectors might go into decline, along with the sort of damages that would come from the Dust Bowl erosion. It's difficult to tease these out during the 1930s because there's so many other large financial shocks that are taking place. So one of the things I look at, for example, is like local bank failure. And so in these more eroded counties, there's more bank failure in the early 1930s. And that could plausibly contribute to sort of a worsening effects of the Depression and reason why canneries or other types of businesses might have difficulty getting access to finance or other parts of the local economy. And so there's a lot that's going on in the 1930s that might sort of reduce other economic activity as well. There's actually that sort of question about what happens to the local non-agricultural economy when the agricultural sector changes is kind of something I take on in some other research of mine that looks at the Ogallala Aquifer in the 1950s and 1960s. There was this particular land underneath the sort of Central Plains region that's over the Ogallala Aquifer that with the invention of sort of pumps and center pivot irrigation machines became increasingly accessible in the 1940s and 1950s. And so you see this huge boom in the agricultural sector in these counties that are over the Ogallala Aquifer pretty sharply compared to counties that are just outside the Ogallala Aquifer. And so what I look at is sort of the local agricultural boom that happens, but then what happens to the local non-agricultural sector? It actually finds that the local non-agricultural sector in these places wasn't particularly affected. That you don't see these really strong spillovers between the agricultural sector and the non-agricultural sector in that particular setting, as opposed to some of my other research that looks at like the manufacturing sector. That when places attract, for example, like large manufacturing plants, that does seem to have a lot of benefits for other local manufacturing plants sort of within the manufacturing sector. But you don't see those same kind of large spillover effects from the agricultural sector to the non-agricultural sector.
Very good. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We have a question from Wendy from early on. The question is, as a researcher, how do you decide which factors to map/analyze your data? And the reason why she's asking that question is she's trying to figure out how to help guide students to figure out these key factors in terms of the drivers for mapping or analyzing your data.
Yeah, I think what you would want to map and analyze depends a lot on what sort of questions you want to answer. And so the way I think about a lot of these sort of projects is there's some set of questions that are sort of interesting questions to try to understand. there's some set of different data that are available, and there's some set of different events that have happened that differentially affected some places relative to other places. And so you look for some combination of some event that's happened that affected some places relative to other places, along with data that are available that can help get at some other general question that we might be interested in. And so trying to think about, well, what sort of variation in the world, what sort of things have happened that can be informative about those sorts of questions. By the way, I'm just kind of monitoring some of the audience chat myself as well as it's coming in kind of fast. So like there was one follow-up question I think from Courtney about would would the
Yeah.
family have been categorized as a Dust Bowl migrant or not a Dust Bowl migrant? Would they have been a depression migrant? And the important thing is to think about, well, okay, they came from Oklahoma, but did they come from like an eroded county in Oklahoma, or did they come from a less eroded county in Oklahoma? And so if they came from a highly eroded county in Oklahoma, I'd say they're more likely to have been a Dust Bowl migrant. But if they came from like a less eroded county in Oklahoma, then they'd be more likely just kind of a general Depression era migrant. By the way, I saw one thing else in the chat about Mexican migrant workers. Um, there's some related kind of interesting work in economics, looking at, for example, like the later end of the Bracero program, which sort of kicked out a lot of Mexican migrant workers from the U.S. and thinks about when places lost access to these Mexican workers, what happened to the sort of use of technology in those that people start using more capital intensive methods when they don't have access to these workers. They start sort of adopting newer technologies or certain technologies that sort of are more accommodating of less access to labor. And so it's kind of an example of how when you have better access to workers, that can sort of delay the adoption of capital or other sorts of technologies. That research itself actually kind of builds on some earlier research of mine that looks at the 1927 Mississippi flood, that there were some places that flooded in 1927, and it actually sparked a large wave of blackout migration from the flooded counties relative to the non-flooded counties, in part because of a lot of racial abuses that took place in the flooded counties and the sort of the immediate aftermath of the flood that sort of increasingly made people from those areas realize that they couldn't depend on sort of white planters in those areas for protection in the sort of paternalistic system that had been set up in the South after emancipation. And so there was a lot of blackout migration from these flooded counties as sort of a preview of the broader blackout migration that was going to take place, the later Great Migration. And so these flooded places that lost access to those workers, you see them sort of adopting more capital equipment, you see them increasing farm sizes, otherwise sort of mechanizing and modernizing agricultural production in the South in response to this loss of labor. And so to give some perspective and some understanding for like why the South was sort of persistently sort of like less developed for a long period of time after emancipation, where sort of white efforts to restrict black labor mobility kind of kept this somewhat captive labor force around in the South and sort of muted the incentives for adopting newer technologies. And so white landowners were profiting from the sort of availability of these lower wage black workers. And once they lost access to those workers, it sort of forced them begrudgingly to kind of like modernize their production.
Good deal, and thank you for reviewing the chat, Rick. I had a few questions from there, and you've already responded to them. Thank you for that. Again, I encourage everyone to continue taking a look at the chat. You know, I have a question about just the studies on. So we're focusing on the migrants. Any data or any reflections on the individuals who remain, the resilience of the communities who remain through it all? And I know that you included that as you looked at the enduring effects. But any other, I guess, additional reflections that you have on the communities who actually remained, in these territories or in these areas, beyond the maps, beyond the specific areas. Are there any other notes that the teachers should consider about the people who actually remain? That's, I guess, I can make it a two-part question. And the second question is as we get closer to the 100-year mark, and 10 years from now when people are looking at the enduring effects? What are things that you think they'll be considering at the 100-year mark as we mark the centennial of these Dust Bowls?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah. So on the first part, so what happened to the people that remained? That's interesting to highlight because indeed, most people did remain. I mean, there was a notable outmigration that sort of captured the imagination of the country then and now, but most people did remain. And so I think that's where it's kind of useful to highlight sort of overall the sort of average incomes of the people that remained and that small number of people who left wasn't particularly lower in these more eroded counties relative to the less eroded counties. So people themselves ended up sort of faring relatively well. They sort of weren't particularly negatively affected, whereas the land itself was quite negatively affected in these more eroded counties. And so, as long as people are mobile and as long as sort of there's migration, the impact on people themselves can be fairly mitigated from these sorts of local environmental shocks. And then the second point is, what are people going to focus on with the 100 year anniversary, coming up? Yeah, it's tough to know. I think I often don't have it's often
Yeah.
don't have a great perspective on like what other people take from this.
Mhm.
Sometimes I just kind of do, and then other people have a better perspective on what it all means. But I'm trying.
Good deal. And scrolling back up to the top of the questions, actually, Mark gets the award for having the first question of the evening. Mark entered this question, I believe, maybe while we were playing music earlier, but his question was: are there comparable situations outside of the United States in your research? Is there any body of research that you point to um, that compares exactly another global event of this magnitude that you draw upon?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. This sort of like large, geographically distinguished environmental shock is not as much.
Hmm.
I mean, one piece of research that I have looks at the sort of early 17th century expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain. So there was this group of sort of Moriscos that were sort of people that were Muslim that converted, sort of forced conversion to Christianity in Spain. And then at some point, the Catholic Church sort of increasingly just doesn't want to tolerate having them in the country. And so this Morisco population is expelled from around Valencia, that sort of region. And they're sort of kicked out. Many of them go to North Africa, uh, and then actually sometimes come back and raid their former lands. But so they're kicked out, and so these places similarly experience sort of severe labor scarcity because essentially in some of these places, 50%, 70% of the population was just removed from some of these places where people were kicked out. And there's sort of an infilling of Christian migrants into these places, but still, population stays fairly low, um, and output per capita, sort of labor productivity in a sense, is elevated in these places for a long period of time. So continues to be this sort of scarcity of workers, and sort of there's not much adaptation for a long period of time. Uh, and so that's kind of a separate episode that maybe people.
Good deal. And and Patricia, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Patricia, and this is a statement, it's not a question that she has, but she mentions that she likes to focus on learning from the past, especially as they face challenges from climate change or other environmental changes related to fires in California. Um, so much good food for thought. Patricia, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. And again, thank you for everyone who's here this evening. As I'm looking through the audience chat, I see everyone, including um, um, their thanks, congratulations on the season. This is the final webinar for tonight, and Rick, we are extremely thankful, deeply grateful for you taking your time out of your schedule to be with us this evening. And everyone, again, We got through another one, another fascinating discussion. And so, if there aren't any additional questions that we have for the evening, I think we're going to wrap things up and allow you all to continue to enjoy the rest of an hopefully an awesome Teachers Appreciation Week for you all. Again, I can't say enough how much I appreciate you all, but I also want to thank Raven Ferguson, who is our education programs coordinator, who is somewhere out there right now listening. Raven has been just a pleasure to work with. I mean, she does some incredibly impactful work for us behind the scenes, coordinating the webinars, communicating with you all, giving you all assurances that you will receive your webinar certificates. And again, I just wanted to take the moment to thank Raven for another successful season. We are preparing, yes, Raven, yes, Sarah, I see your yay, Raven, in there. We are preparing for the 24-25 series. And not to divulge too many details, but we have sent out our invitations, and we are working to solidify our lineup for the 24-25 season. So please stay tuned. You all will hear more about it in August when the registration window opens up. But again, we will be back for another one. And again, Rick, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to following your research, continuing to follow the work that you're doing. If the staff at the National Humanities Center, if we can ever support your work and spread the word on any new projects, please do not hesitate to let me know. If you are interested in following the work of Dr. Hornbeck, you can find him at Rick_Hornbeck online, and you should be able to find information there. Keep up with all that's happening at the National Humanities Center via our social media feeds. You can find us at National NATL Humanities or at NHC Education in your various social media feeds. Please feel free to tag us in the work that you all are doing. And also, please support the humanities education programs. The NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teaching and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools they and their students need to make a difference. Thank you so much for participating in the Humanities in Class webinar series 23-24. The 24-25 webinar series will begin in September for, yes, our 10th season, a decade-long series of webinars that we've had that you all have joined and supported us faithfully. Registration will open August the 15th, 2024. Visit our webpage for more information and more details. Again, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this session, the Woody Guthrie Center. Thanks to Katie Shaw and her entire staff for all the work that you all are doing. We look forward to joining you all in Tulsa this summer for the Artificial Intelligence and Digital Literacy Summit, June 13th. I encourage you all, if you have someone who's in your network or any of your colleagues who would be available, please encourage them to join us. Information is available on our NHC website. Or if you would like to reach out to me directly, please feel free to reach out at mwilliams@nationalhumanitiescenter.org. This will conclude the session. Everyone have a restful and restorative summer. I am only just an email away. If you ever need anything, take care and be well. We appreciate you. We will finish out with Little Woody Guthrie.
This land is your land, and this land is